deductive reasoning is drawing a conclusion based on logical reasonings. So conclusions based on logic or logical reasoning. Okay, so for example, I've noticed that every time I kick a ball, it comes back down. Therefore, the next time I kick a ball, it will probably come back down. Since you're noticing it based on a pattern, this would be your inductive reasoning. Okay, the next one, well, that's Newton's law. Everything that goes up must come back down. So if you kick a ball up, it must come down. Based on the logic that we know and facts that we know, you're concluding that it will come back down. That would be your deductive reasoning. Okay, so from here, it says if B is the midpoint of AC, of segment AC, then the length of AB is equal to the length of BC. Well, we're given that B is the midpoint of AC. Okay, that means this, if B is the midpoint of AC, that represents your Q, your P in the conditional statement. Okay, your conjecture, your assumption is that AB is, segment AB would be congruent to segment BC by the definition of midpoint, or what they told us, the length of AB equals the length of BC by the definition of midpoint. Okay, now the converse of this would be if we were given that AB, the length AB equals the length of BC. So if the length AB equals the length BC, then our conjecture would be that B is the midpoint of AC. However, we could draw AB and BC as completely separate segments. So if you were to say, oh, here is AB, and it's congruent to this point, this line segment BC, we could say, oh yeah, that's congruent to that, but you can see that B could not be a midpoint because of this curve here. So the converse in this case would be invalid or not true, because this right here would be a counterexample. Okay, so that's your counterexample. Next, we're going to talk about the law of detachment. The law of detachment just simply means that if P implies Q is true, and, so this is an and symbol, and P is true, then Q is true. So basically this is common sense. If the conditional is true, that if P, then Q, if that's true, then whenever P is Q, Q has to be true. Okay? It's just stating that if the conditional is true, both the parts are true when they're in the conditional. The law of syllogism is like your transitive property. So it's saying if P implies Q, and Q implies, let me grab a different color, and Q implies R, then P implies R. Okay? So this would be the conclusion you could make. So if this is true, then this conclusion would be true. Okay? So an example of that would be, if it's raining, then it's pouring. If it's pouring, the old man is snoring. Well, if it is raining, it's raining, that's going to be your P, okay? Then it's pouring, that's going to be your Q, okay? And the old man is snoring, that's going to be your R, okay? So it's pouring again would be your Q. So we would end up saying, since if it's raining, then it's pouring. So if P implies Q and Q implies R, then P implies R. So if it is raining, then the old man is snoring. Okay, that's an example of your law of syllogism. If two angles are not adjacent, then they are not a linear pair. If two angles are vertical angles, then they are not adjacent. Well, we know from our law of syllogism that it states if P, then Q, and if Q, then R, then the conclusion would be P implies R. Well, you notice that the part that is repeated is your Q. So that means in our sentence, whatever is repeated is going to be our Q. We see two angles are not adjacent here, and they are not adjacent here. So this is going to be your Q. This tells us that our sentences are written in the wrong order because the first sentence is if P then Q. So whichever one Q comes second in, that's going to be our first statement. Well, we can see if two angles are vertical angles, then the Q, they are not adjacent. So we know that two angles are vertical angles. This has to be our P. Okay? So then if Q, then R. So if Q, two angles are not adjacent, then they are not a linear pair, will be the R. So for your conclusion, if P, then R, we could say if two angles are vertical angles, which you know form the X and are congruent to each other. So if two angles are vertical angles, then your R is true. They are not a linear pair. And again, this was your law of syllogism.